result of that, the idea over here is that unlike the first form of loan in which you get something as a collateral, if you go bankrupt, in cash to lending, you don't get anything. If, for instance, they end up bankruptcy, other than whatever proceeds are uh, obtained from that financing, from the bankruptcy sales. And then you have long-term financing, which can take the form of junk bonds, which are high yield. Okay, if you're not familiar with the concept of yield, yield is just like the interest on a loan or the return that you might expect from a given debt. So high yield would be occurring where the risk is very high. Why? Because risk and return should be proportional to each other. If a given loan is extremely risky, then you would end up with a very high yield bond. If, on the other hand, the loan or the debt is not particularly risky, like as an example, the US Treasury debt or the German debt, German bonds, they are not particularly very risky, then you don't end up with very high yield. So these are high yield junk bonds, and these are often used in leverage buyouts. If you don't know what leverage buyouts are, that's what we'll spend most of the lecture on. So at this point, if you're missing out anything, we'll be once again coming back to that with a few more examples later. I'm just giving you an overview. And then you have leveraged bank loans. These are also very similar to these high yield junk bonds. They're also used in leveraged buyouts. And then you have, just like these asset-based secured loans, you have something called term loans. So these are very, very secure loans, and these come typically with things like covenants. So what are covenants? Covenants are basically boundaries or rules which tell the particular company that they cannot do something or they are required to do something. So there are two forms of covenants. One is essentially where firms are required to do something, and then there is another form of covenant where firms are not required to do something. So what does that mean? It means that if they are reaching certain targets, then that would be one form of covenant where the lenders provide a sort of a covenant which says that the borrower has to reach certain earnings target, as an example. Another form of covenant where firms are not required to do something or not allowed to do something would be, say, sale of certain assets. So those would be negative covenants where these borrowers are not allowed to, say, sell particular assets, quite simply because they might be pledged. Yes, Melissa.
You mentioned at the top right term loans as well. Is the only difference the duration, that's short term and this one is long term, or how does it differ?
Yes, so primarily the difference between the asset-based secured lending and term loans is the length. In both these cases, they are pledged against a collateral. So there's a collateral which has to be pledged against them. And there are covenants which are involved in them, especially for term loans. And you can convert these asset-based secured lending using a fee into these term loans. Now, if you look at this collection of loans, you have well, actually, let's get back to that later. So just to give you an idea right now, even if this is far too, new or complicated, the main idea over here is that there are two ways that you can finance a merger. The first way is through borrowing. The second way is through common or preferred equity. So you essentially issue equity, and in return, that's how you finance a merger. And the first way is that you borrow from different parties in the financial markets in different ways. So there are different types of loans, some of which are extremely risky. As an example, these junk bonds or leveraged bank loans or unsecured lending. And then you also have very less risky forms of loans, which come in the form of asset-based secured lendings or long-term financing. So how do we choose? This is very similar to take you back to how do we choose to pay. The first dimension which really matters when choosing between debt and equity is preference for dilution by acquirer shareholders. So let us give an example over here. I have come up with a very toy example based on whatever limited knowledge I have over here. Well, actually, I forgot the names of those companies. So let's skip that one. Yeah, okay. So another example, Vodafone and Nosh. Now, suppose Vodafone is acquiring Nosh. In that case, it has to make a choice to pay Nosh, either to pay Nosh in either debt or, sorry, cash or equity. And this it has to pay to Nosh. And this payment, for securing this payment, it has to either issue equity or it has to borrow in the form of debt. So borrow or from all these parties. Now, if for instance Vodafone has a very high earnings per share, so if the earnings per share is very high and the ownership base is extremely concentrated, then paying Nosh using equity is not particularly a very bad outcome. Why? Because the concern about dilution or earnings per share going down or individual shareholders' claims to profits going down is not a big concern for the acquirer shareholders because the ownership base is concentrated, earnings per share are very high, so paying with equity makes far more sense. On the other hand, if the base is extremely diluted, which means that initially itself the earnings per share are quite low and the acquirer shareholders are plenty. In that case, paying NOSH, or for instance, if you have to issue a lot of equity, in that case, paying NOSH using equity is not necessarily the best idea, quite simply because you will end up with much more dilution. So that takes care of the first concern, which is preference for dilution by acquirer shareholders. The second is something that we have covered before, which is preference for cash or acquirer shares. Now, if you're going to pay the target shareholders using cash, so in this case, if you were to pay NOSH using cash, you have to either use your internal reserves or as is true in many cases, you have to borrow from other parties. So you have to basically raise borrow loans such that you can pay cash to Nosh. Now, this preference for cash acquirer shares is determined by things like the risk preference of these target shareholders, the tax incidence, so whether they want to pay taxes now or they want to pay them in the future, and all the other factors that we covered in, I think, the second lecture. But nonetheless, the preference for payment also plays a big role in how you raise financing. Then there's, of course, capital market conditions. This is a bit more self explanatory. When there's plenty of capital going around, when the cost of debt is low, or your company is, for instance, overvalued, in that case, when the cost of capital in general is quite low, in that case, you very well might want to pay with whichever is the cheapest form of, so pay with the cheapest, or so raise the cheapest form of capital. And then you have got liquidity and creditworthiness, very similar lines. Liquidity essentially implies how easily you can convert anything into a liquid asset, any particular asset into a liquid asset, or how in this particular case you can easily raise capital. And creditworthiness specifically refers to how how much you're seen to be creditworthy or worthy of being issued debt by the lenders. And then you have got the incremental borrowing capacity of the combined firm, which effectively means that in this case, if Vodafone and Nosh individually can have only say 20%, but as an example, the combined company, okay, I'm just calling them Vodafone plus Nosh, but the combined company can say raise 50%, then this incremental borrowing capacity, this higher borrowing capacity might cause you to borrow at this moment so that you can pay down later. Now, these are all factors that more or less we covered. The main point that I want to get to is something called Modigliani-Miller violations. Yeah, Marty?
Yeah, good morning, Professor. I was just wondering if the creditworthiness of a company, of the acquirer, typically changes if they're acquiring another company, just because they're asking for more debt and making it more riskier, or the other company has a better rating than them, and it could change if the acquisition goes through or something like that.
Yes, it absolutely can. Quite simply because, yeah, it absolutely can. Because the combined company might have a very different risk profile than the individual companies. Also, there might be a possibility that the company raises far too much debt in the process of acquisition. So, creditworthiness can change during the process itself. Yeah, João?
Sorry, I was just wondering if you could go again why, if the earnings per share are increasing, the first one might be a good idea to finance the merger.
So, what exactly is earnings per share? Earnings per share is your, as a shareholder, the main claim that you have to a company is profits. It's through the dividends that are paid out to you and the earnings of that company. So you have the residual claim on the company's profits after all the interests are paid and so on. Now, what happens is that imagine that if you have like a pie, and this is once again a very poorly drawn circle, but as an example, if as an individual shareholder you have got like a pie of the profits, and this resembles your claim to the company. Now, what happens is that now the company goes to issue more debt, and now you have got all these target shareholders who are also participating. So your claim goes down. So what happens in this case is that your claim as an individual shareholder has gone down over the overall company, and because of that, the amount of you know profit sharing that you can do within that company or amount that you might expect from that company also goes down as a result of the claim on the overall company's profits going down. So in that sense, if your claim is very low to begin with, as is the case over here, then you may not want to dilute your claim even further by asking your company to issue more shares. If on the other hand your claim is very large, this is but you get the idea. If your claim is very large, then in that case the dilution won't be particularly as large, and especially if other factors also work really well for you, which is things like capital market conditions, and so basically the cost of capital in this case for equity is very low, then in that case for your company to pay using equity is better, because in that case debt is far more costly, can cause you to engage in cost cutting measures in the future. So as a result of that, preference for dilution plays quite a big role. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
So the point of this is that this is just a very quick snapshot of how to finance a merger. Now, this is the reason why I'm going through this a bit quickly is because other than the fact that there are different type of borrowing, this is more or less what we have covered previously when we talk about how to choose to pay. A lot of these factors are very similar to how to choose to pay. But what is really new over here is that there is something called Modigliani-Miller theory violations. Now, so far we have talked mainly about the value of synergy and control. What is synergy? To repeat, value of A plus B is greater than value of A plus value of B. And what is control? It means that the value of optimally run B is greater than the value of status quo B. Now, Modigliani-Miller violations are a very specific set, which essentially we'll get to what Modigliani-Miller theorem are in the next slides. But if you have covered them, what excellent. If you have covered them, well, at least now you see if some things are not going to be tested in the exam. But if you have covered them in the past, the Modigliani-Miller violations essentially mean that if there are deviations from the violations, deviation from the theorem, then you can end up with more value just because of deviation from the perfect capital markets. Most likely, these deviations occur in the form of tax shield of debt. And this can create value for you, especially if we are talking about something like LBO. And the second way you can have value beyond synergy and control is just buying undervalued assets. But undervalued assets, to a certain extent, does overlap with synergy and control. And furthermore, valuation of identifying undervalued assets is not very straightforward because in many cases, just like synergy and controls, nonetheless, managers might think that certain assets are undervalued wrongly. So they might actually think that, something is undervalued when it actually is not. And this overlaps, this motivation overlaps quite a bit with control and synergies as well, in the sense that an asset might be undervalued quite simply because it's not being deployed in the right way. And similarly, it might be undervalued because, it might also be undervalued because it's not being combined with other firms in the right way. So because of that, undervalued assets is not something special that needs to be devoted a lot of energy to. But this particular dimension, which is Modigliani-Miller theorem violations, especially play a big role in what we refer to as leveraged buyouts. They drive an entire industry of a specific type of mergers exists precisely because of them. And I realize several of you have reached out to me also asking me about question 5 in the problem set. I think the third bullet point on the slide might also help you answer that question. So what is the Modigliani-Miller theorem? If you have a background in finance, you already know this, but if you do not have a background in finance, let me introduce it for you. Modigliani-Miller theorem is one of this idea in finance. Well, there are a couple of theorems, but the specific one is that, to give you a general gist of the theorems, it's that if capital markets are perfect, which means there are no transaction costs, there are no taxes, there are no agency conflicts, there is no information asymmetry, the cash is being used perfectly by firms. By information asymmetry, I mean that firms and investors have the access to the same information. Then in that case, the total value of the firm would not depend on the financial structure. So when Modigliani was interviewed on this particular theorem, he answered it, well, I don't remember whether it was pizza or pie, but someone can correct me. He was interviewed on this. He basically said that no matter how you cut a pie, the total amount of the pie remains the same. Similarly, no matter how you are cutting the firm, whether into debt or equity, the value of the firm remains the same. And that only holds true when capital markets are perfect. Not always. So it's not always the case that the value of the firm is the same despite its financing structure. To go a bit more into detail on this, suppose you have got two firms. One is, and you're an investor. So one firm is, say, 25% debt. Here I'm using debt with the slanted lines. And the other one is, say, I don't know how much this is, 67% debt. If there are no information asymmetries, if there are no agency conflicts, and if there are no transaction costs as an investor, or if there are no taxes, then in that case, as an investor, you do not need the firms to make a choice between debt or equity, quite simply because on your own you can buy certain portions of firm A and firm B such that you end up with a certain mix of debt and equity. To give you an idea, if I have, oh, sorry, I wrote here 67%. To give you an idea of what I mean, suppose now instead of having 25% debt and 67% debt, you have one which is just 0% debt, and the second one is 100% debt. Then as an investor who wants, a mix of 50% debt, 50% equity, I can just buy shares of company A and company B in the right amount so that I end up with that particular mix in my own portfolio. The companies on their own end do not need to do any rebalancing or, change their financial structure. So all of this holds true only when capital markets are perfect, which implies no taxes, no corporate taxes. Transaction cost, this is all no, so no transaction cost. Cash is being used properly by companies, so no issue of excess cash. No excess cash problem. There are no agency conflicts. And no information asymmetry between the managers of the firm and the investors. If anything is not clear, just raise your hand or, unmute yourself and ask a question. Now, this is one of the theorems is very well, encapsulated in this first line, which basically says the value of the levered firm is equal to the value of unlevered firm. In other words, the financial structure of the firm does not matter. The second one is in case there is a violation of Modigliani-Miller. And in this case, the violation is occurring from corporate taxes. So what is happening over here? What this is saying is that the value of the levered firm is equal to the value of unlevered firm plus tax shield multiplied by debt. Now, why do taxes matter? When you raise debt, you pay interest. And when you pay interest, you don't pay taxes on that interest. So that much amount that you pay less taxes on is referred to as the tax shield of debt. In other words, you're being shielded from debt. You're being shielded from debt by this additional interest payments that you're making on debt. In other words, taking on more debt will lead to higher tax shield, and thereby you can increase the value of your firm by taking on more debt, so increasing this portion, and thereby the value of the levered firm or value of the firm with debt goes on increasing. Of course, this is not without cost because there are also bankruptcy costs. If you take on a lot of debt, then you're also going to expose your firm to much more bankruptcy cost, and not to complicate things, but cost of equity is also likely to change. So this is one source of valuation where we can create value just by deviating from this Modigliani-Miller theorem, which is where in a world where corporate taxes exist. And we do exist in such a world. There are other versions, which is things like transaction cost, agency conflicts. Agency conflicts are cases where the owner and the manager of the firm, when they are separate, in that case, the manager of the firm does not necessarily act in the best interest of the owners of the firm. And information asymmetry, which is where the investors and the managers of the firm do not necessarily have access to the same information. Yes, Francisco.
Sorry, Professor. Just wondering, in the example that you showed us with the pies, so what you're saying is when the market is completely functioning well with no problems at all, uh, either investors can just change the structure of the capital without any problems. Is that it?
Sorry, can you repeat the last part?
No, what I was asking if there are no obstacles in the market, such as transaction costs and info asymmetries. I was wondering if the investor, either A or B, can just change its capital structures in the form that he wants. In this sense, in this case, with no problems in the market.
So in this case, actually, it's not the investor A or B, it's the firm A or B. So as an investor, you can decide to buy A or B's shares in such a proportion such that basically you can create your own risk profile of the portfolio. It's a similar idea to diversification. The reason why diversification of public firms does not necessarily create value for investors is because as an investor, you can yourself create that portfolio. You do not need firms to engage in mergers with each other when you can yourself buy those stocks and thereby, diversify and get rid of that diversifiable risk.
So basically, if I'm an investor under these conditions, I can just choose whatever fits me in my profile.
Exactly.
Okay.
So in this case, you can create your own portfolio or create such a portfolio which fits your risk preferences or your preferences for certain leverage. So the firms themselves are not going to gain or lose any value by setting themselves in a particular way, or as this says, the CFO can neither create nor destroy value for shareholders by changing the financial structure.
Okay,
so
thank you.
those are the deviations from the Modigliani-Miller theorem. So far what we covered was value from synergy, value from control. Now we also end up with one more, which just comes from mainly debt. And the reason why mainly debt is because these other formats like agency conflicts or information asymmetry, they also many times fall under value of control. Actually, there's quite a strong overlap on that. But tax shield of debt is something which is very specifically related to Modigliani-Miller theorem, and that is likely to create value for the firm. So, especially when we talk about private equity firms, which I'm not going to go into, there's an appendix on that matter, but there is an entire course on private equity which is delivered. From what I've heard, it's a great course. So, I'm not going to do all of that again. Especially private equity firms have a preference for financing with debt. And why is that? The first one is tax savings from debt. So, this is the violation of Modigliani-Miller theorem. I'm going to just use MN theorem going forward for the sake of me writing this. The second is high-powered incentives. So these come both from leverage and from they also come from the structure of things like LBOs, which we'll get back to a little bit later. Then there's discipline management. So when it comes to debt holders are often very good monitors of the firm, and they can prevent things like empire building, where the managers of the firm might either, this is not empire building specifically, but they might be using cash flows to pursue their own particular goals, or they might be building empires to entrench themselves far more in the company, something that we covered in the first lecture. Then there's also send credible signal to market about confidence. So this links a bit more to information asymmetries. This is mainly because if you're taking on a substantial amount of debt, then you should be confident in the capacity. So just taking on debt might itself be a signal to the markets about the confidence of your confidence in your merger. And then finally, I've got repeat players in debt markets. So many of these private equity firms often have very strong connections within the debt markets, and thereby they might be ending up with good terms. Specifically, their sponsors are, in many cases, have very good connections, and as a result of that, they might be able to get good debt terms. For those of you who are actually studying private equity or venture capital, the reputational capital plays a very big role in those markets. But how do we go with debt? One of the most common ways is leveraged buyouts. And one of the reasons why leveraged buyouts matter especially is because LBOs do not pay taxes for close to 5 to 7 years on average post buyouts. This is mainly because of very high amount of debt and also because of restructuring. So in other words, the potential, because they are not paying taxes because of debt, for Modigliani-Miller theorem violations and value creation from that is very high in these specific cases. So the leverage buyouts proceed in the following way, and then we'll get to an example right in the next slide, if this is far too much descriptive stuff. You start off by purchasing a control of a company, and then you finance the deal using debt backed by the target's assets. So pay attention here by the target's asset, which is a bit unique. You basically are pledging the assets of your target and getting debt against that. This is the secured lending that we talked about earlier, or the asset-backed debt. And equity investment. This equity investment typically comes in the form of private equity. It's a very small portion, it's a very concentrated form of equity, as opposed to equity in the sense that you will be going to the public markets and issuing a large amount of equity to them. Instead, it's just private investors who are investing and getting equity in return. So this is more so from the private investors. And the way you pay down this debt over time is you use the company's free cash flow to pay down the debt. So pay attention over here what's happening. What's happening is that you're using the target's assets and you're using the target company's free cash flows, or the combined company's free cash flows in many cases, to pay down the debt over time. So in this case, you're kind of financing using the target company and using your own private equity. So that's how you basically pay down that debt. So you take this debt from here and you pay it down using the free cash flows. How exactly does that payment structure work? We'll get to that in a couple of slides. But nonetheless, those are a bit of peculiar aspects of these leveraged buyouts. And sometimes you add new debt or you pay shareholders a dividend. That's a bit second order, quite simply because, that those are choices which are often made by the company. Yes, Alessandro.
Professor, for equity investment, we intend both the money that the LP at the beginning is putting in, and also the mezzanine fund, or only the money of the LP at the beginning of the investment?
You mean to say whether, okay, so it is also the message. So to give you a very precise example of this, yes, it's everything goes in right at the beginning, if I can actually. So you do have the equity, you also have the subordinated debt which comes in right at the start, and you also have the senior debt which comes in at the start. So I will get to this once again later, but essentially the purchase price is financed using both often equity as well as different forms of debt right at the start. And to give you a very precise example of that I will give you is the RGR Nabisco LBO structure, where essentially it's a mixture of both right at the beginning. So it's not the money that doesn't come in slowly, it's more so the entire structure is built in right at the beginning. So yeah. And then one more dimension of this is that in most cases, you sell the company to another firm or the public. So there is an exit strategy over here. So you start off by purchasing the firm. You finance the deal using debt, which is backed by the target's assets, and then you sell. So there's an exit strategy. And in most cases, this exit strategy is already baked into the leveraged buyout decisions made by these firms. Now, what does that exit strategy look like? To very quickly summarize, it can be things like IPOs, it can be secondary buyouts, which is basically just the sponsor sells, but everyone, all the
integration.
Yes, so very much. So especially if you guys are doing private equity, the reason why I don't want to go a bit more on that is because of the fact that that's a different entire course on its own. But if for those of you who are doing private equity, general partners in private equity firms, general partners in private equity arrangements are often extremely engaged in the whole firm when they are, when the firm is under their control. To give you a very precise example of that, there's actually a research paper which looks at flights and cancellations of flights. And what that paper shows is that when general partners are actually not able to make the flights to their destinations and visit these companies in person, the performance of those companies becomes worse. So these general partners are often bringing in a lot of capital in terms of human capital, where they are paying a lot of attention to these firms firsthand in terms of they're paying a lot of attention to these firms and putting a lot of effort. So in terms of both monitoring as well as in terms of the Modigliani Miller tax shield, they are trying to create value. So they create value mainly from two sources, something we'll get to in a little bit as well. The first source is obviously the theorem violations. The second source is also by generating or gaining as much of value of control as possible, because they're uniquely positioned in many cases, given their expertise in these areas, to monitor these firms and to really make sure that these firms are going to perform and live up to their potential before they can sell them at the highest price. And the exit value or the exit valuation, exit multiples, play quite a big role in the overall return on investment. So they're incentivized as well to really, try to gain as much as possible from these leveraged buyouts or from monitoring. Yeah, Melissa.
Just a quick question. The equity investment and the management at the bottom, they both refer to the side of the private equity firm, right? So, and an equity investment in the private equity firm and the management of the private equity firm.
Exactly. So okay. Management, so it could be two ways. One could be there could be an external firm, or the other one is where that it could just be the management themselves. So the management themselves could buy the firm, or it could be external firms. So let me actually take you to the next slide. In this case, the example that we covered right in the first class, if you remember, that was the RJ Nabisco example. That was a firm which was a textbook example of agency problems, where the CEO, Ross Johnson, F. Ross Johnson, was really building these hangars, airplane hangars, and he was, being extravagant with all the resources of the company. And what was happening was that the company's share price was lagging. Now, because the company's share price was lagging so terribly, it was often seen as a target by many other companies. Why? Perhaps because of synergies, but also mainly because of control. If you can just change the control, you can potentially increase the share price of that company. And the precise valuation is actually the outcome of the valuation is something we'll see in a few slides, where most of the improvements in the company were estimated to occur just because of control. So this was a company, Archer Nabisco, which was quite poorly managed, and it was the target of many takeover attempts, or at least the rumors of several takeover attempts. So the CEO, F. Ross Johnson, in order to prevent this takeover attempt, he made a leveraged buyout announcement. Now, during this announcement, what he said was that the group would buy the stock for $75 per share, and they would take the company private. So it was a publicly traded firm, and they would just take the company private. Now, the share price immediately shot up to, funnily enough, precisely the exact same value as they were planning to take it private. And because of this announcement, other parties jumped in. Now, there were multiple parties, but the most relevant party here was Kohlberg, Kravis, and Roberts. And it's also a great place to work at in case any of you are looking for careers later, but they basically bid $90. And the payment format was $79 cash plus payment in kind preferred shares valued at $11 per share. So these are called PIK or payment in kind. So payment in kind can be of two types. It can be for debt, or it can be also for preferred shares. And for debt, what essentially would be that instead of getting more interest, you'll just receive more bonds instead of interest. And for payment in kind preferred shares, instead of receiving more dividends, you will just receive more of preferred shares. So it's a specific kind of payment mechanism. So this was the agreed arrangement that they were offering: $79 in cash plus payment in kind preferred shares valued at $11 per share. So overall, they were offering 90 compared to the 75 from the company itself. And if this is confusing, the CEO and the management decided to operate separately. So they created an independent board committee from Archer Nabisco's management, which was operating independently of the CEO, such that there would not be any conflict of interest. Now, what happened in this case was, to go back to your question, Melissa, what is happening over here is that a portion of the management, that CEO F. Ross Johnson, wants to take the company private using this LBO structure. And then there is this external party, Kohlberg, Kravis, and Roberts, who also wants to take the company private, but they are an external party, and they are also going to use the exact same financing structure. Now, what happened was that Johnson and KKR got into this bidding war along with a few more other parties, and KKR eventually bid $109 per share. Johnson bid $112 per share. And then what happened was that board chose KKR over Johnson, quite simply because, well, this is not right. Yeah, so because of the fact that KKR was offering more generous terms to the management. So they were offering better protection to the employees as compared to Johnson. So they were willing to forego this $3 per share. Now, why is this relevant? Because this was at that point one of the largest leveraged buyouts. And as we go through this lecture, this is the example which we'll keep on referring back to. As opposed to the first lecture where this was all very abstract, this time we'll actually look at the exact valuation of this company, not the whole valuation spreadsheet, but just the exact structure of the LBO and where the sources of value were supposed to be as per the the announcement. Now, how do you choose whether a target makes a good LBO candidate? First of all, think about the following. You're going to pledge the debt. You're going to pledge the assets of the target and to get debt and pay that debt using cash flows of the target, free cash flows of target. So in other words, the target should have stable cash flows for sure, otherwise you're creating an enormous amount of risk, and they should also have high quality assets. So assets, good assets, and good cash flows. And that's exactly what we see over here. First is that the target should be able to bear a large debt load, because you're raising the debt against the you're raising the debt against the assets of the firm. The second is that the cash flow should be very stable and predictable. Why? Because you're making that payment using the free cash flows of the target. And in terms of the market position, it should be strong, established, and insulated. Why insulated? Because it has to be insulated from the risk to its cash flows. The industry should be mature, stable, and recession-proof. Once again, what we are looking for over here are very predictable and stable cash flows. Now, the CapEx and net working capital should also have low requirements and predictable needs. Why? Because all of these things go into the free cash flows. If the CapEx is very volatile or net working capital is very volatile, your free cash flows are very volatile, and your debt payment plan is gets super complicated. And there should be an abundance of collateralizable assets. So why do we need an abundance of these assets? Because we are going to pledge the assets of the target. So think about our needs. We need a company which is going to have good assets that we can pledge to raise debt, and that we can use free cash flows, whose free cash flows we can use to basically pay down this debt going forward. Of course, if you're going to engage in a leveraged buyout, you have to end up with potential for efficiency gains. What are these efficiency gains over here? What are these efficiency gains over here? Control. So this is a very standard formula often in things like private equity. You take over a firm, you engage, get all the efficiency gains as much as possible, and then you sell off the firm. So potential for efficiency gains is very important, because otherwise, even if all of the conditions in the first bullet point hold, you are still ending up with a firm which is engaging is essentially, you cannot create much value over there. The whole transaction needs to be worth something. Whenever you're getting value of synergy, value of control, the Modigliani-Miller theorem violations, anything, you really need to be able to ensure that those are all about your transaction costs and your offer price. And finally, you are going to sell off the company, so strong potential exit opportunities. So good market in which you can sell these things. And the exit strategy is often thought of right at the beginning of an LBO. So we need a target which can bear a large debt load, good opportunities for gaining through control, and strong possibilities for exit. This is exactly in line with the entire structure of an LBO, which is raise debt, pay down debt, create value, and sell. All right, if there are no questions, let me provide you with an analogy. Consider buying a house. Now, this is a very good analogy for a leveraged buyout, because a typical mortgage, at least in the US, the source here is Federal Reserve. I'm specifically referring to the US because they have a very strong buying culture, consists of 20% down payment and 80% bank loan. So this is the mortgage loan. And what it translates to is that the 20% of down payment that you're making is basically your equity in the house. The 80% bank loan ends up as 80% debt. What this means in practice is, say, if you buy a house worth $100,000, then you're going to potentially be required to make a down payment of a certain amount, in this case $20,000, and the bank loan, that is the residual amount, is going to be $80,000. So you're going to, in the US especially, it's very common to get mortgage loans. In many countries, the down payment, especially in countries with not good credit markets or not creditor-friendly regimes, legal regimes, in those cases, often the down payment is close to this the actual price. So what you see in this chart is not exactly for 100,000, so that we are clear, but what you see is the payment structure. Every year what you pay, how does it split into interest and principal? What happens at the beginning is that your interest payments are very large. How do I do this? So your interest payments, whatever payments that you're making towards the debt, are mainly going to paying down the interest. So interest is greater than principal payment. As you go down, your payment of paying down the principal goes up. So you pay more of the principal down, and your interest payment goes down. So here, principal is more than interest. If that is not clear, we'll be doing a specific numerical example of this. But right now, this is just a visual representation, which basically shows that when you're buying a house, as an example, the interest payments are whatever payment you're making towards debt is mainly going towards interest in the beginning, and then towards principal, more towards principal later on. The analogy over here of buying a house is very similar to a leveraged buyout. Why? Because instead of, say, buying a house of 100,000, now suppose you're buying a company of 100,000, and then you invest this equity of 20,000, and the remaining comes from debt. So you have to pay down this debt of 80,000. This is the debt, and this is your equity. And to restate or refresh your memory on this, debt consists of principal, which is the initial amount, and interest, which is basically the interest payments that you're making on that principal, on the debt. So the buying the house and a leveraged buyout are very similar in that sense. And if it is not clear from this slide, in the next slide it becomes even more so clear. So what you see over here is the equity versus debt schedule. Let us go back to our example. House, or call it target. Both ways it's the same thing. You have a debt payment, and you have the composition of the ownership. So initially, when you get a house, 100,000, and the 20,000 that you make as down payment is your equity, and the remaining 80,000 is your debt. Even if you're engaging in a leveraged buyout, it's the exact same thing. What happens is that as you pay down the debt, your equity goes up. Till at some point, you are basically owning the firm, and your debt has gone down considerably. Now, most companies will not necessarily wait till it goes down to absolutely zero. The precise value or the target debt to equity ratio really depends on what is optimal. What is the optimal time to sell? So before a company engages in a leveraged buyout, it will target this debt to equity ratio at which it will want to sell. But to give you an idea, when you engage in a leveraged buyout, you start off with this debt and equity, and then you gradually pay down your debt, and your equity in the firm keeps on going up. Okay. Now, any questions so far?
Could you go back one slide?
Mm-hmm.
So this one, it's showing, so first of all of this assumes that paying down the debt is actually possible so that the firm is in fact cash flow strong, etc. And so this slide is like representing just the debt to equity ratio, like in the company.
It's representing the dollar amount. This is basically, if you look at it visually, then if you were to just draw it like this, then whatever this is would just remaining be all the equity, and this would be all debt. Let me just erase that. But you get the idea.
Okay. Thank you.
And to go to the first assumption, cash flow strong. Yes, so that is a very valid point, but that is precisely why the cash flows of the target need to be super stable and predictable, because then we can use those cash flows to pay down the debt. If the cash flows were not predictable, then there's no guarantee that we would basically be making this entire annual payments in the way that we would be. So that's why we want to ensure that our cash flows are stable. So now let us once again go back to the analogy of buying a house, or something called cash sweep. How do we pay down the debt? Now, suppose that we are extremely stingy. We are making our mortgage payment every month. We are living extremely frugally. We are not spending anything on going outside, which is not much of a problem right now, but still. And at the end of the month, you use all of your remaining cash to pay down the balance on your mortgage. So what this, in the perspective of a company, you take all your free cash flows, and whatever after interest you have got left, those free cash flows after interest, those ones are all going to go towards paying the debt. So interest has to be paid. You don't have an option on this dimension. But then you use whatever is left to pay down your debt. This is a very extreme case where you just don't invest anything, you don't pay anything into dividend holders, you only are interested in paying down debt. This is a specific scenario called a cash sweep. And what we will do in the next two slides are specific examples of the cash sweep. So, first of all, what is the internal rate of return? So here I've got something called internal rate of return. Can someone tell me what the internal rate of return is? I mean, as a general concept, yeah. Sorry.
It's the maximum cost of capital that it's still profitable for your company to have.
Mm-hmm.
Maximum rate, yeah.
So it is the interest rate which sets the net present value to exactly zero. So the interest rate which will set your net present value to exactly zero is your internal rate of return. And this is often used in cases like private equity, where they're interested in seeing how a specific investment works out. So that's the internal rate of return. Now, just to absolutely be clear from the perspective of the exam, the internal rate of return calculations will not be in the exam. This is simply for demonstration purposes. If anything, actually, with the exception of just the first part, which is how to choose, all the rest of this chapter, given that we are just a week away from the exam, will be mainly in multiple choice. So I'm not going to put this in the case study portion, because otherwise it's too little time for you to revise something for such a high grade, for high proportion of the overall grade. So let's assume that the projected free cash flows of this company are 20 million per annum forever, and that is the interest expense, is 20%. I'm sorry, I'm a bit confused at this point. Just give me a second. Yeah, the R should be 10%. That's what I was thinking, because the interest expense here is 10%. Now, this is a scenario where all the initial capitalization is entirely through equity, and the sale is occurring at the end of the 5th year. So, perfect LBO setup. You have got the equity, but you don't have, in this case, the debt, and sale is occurring, so you have an exit strategy in place. You're not going to stay in the company forever. So you've got the free cash flows of 20 million every year. Then you don't have any interest expense. Why? Because you don't have any debt. All of this is coming from equity. And so that is all zero. The free cash flow to equity is 20. And then you are paying the dividends. Are you paying the dividends? Just hold on a second. Okay, you're paying the dividends of 20 million, and then the cash flows that you're ending up with every single year are cash flows to the owners, that is, will be 20, because that comes mainly from the dividends. And so every year it's 20, the initial outlay is 100, so that's 100 million. In the final year, when you sell, you get 100. So now if you do this calculation as minus 100 plus 20 divided by 1 plus IRR plus 20 plus 1 plus IRR square, and so on, plus 100 plus divided by 1 plus IRR raised to 6 is equal to 0. And if you calculate for this IRR, which you will not be doing in the exam because this is not going to be tested, then you will end up with this value. Actually, you don't have to do this calculation. In most financial calculators, at least the ones that I have used, IRRs have this very nice thing where you just input all these values and then that gives you the IRR. But what you're seeing over here on this particular slide, going away from the IRR and all the calculations, is quite simply that the internal capital is entirely coming from equity. There is no debt, no interest expense, and you're ending up with an internal rate of return of 18%. Yeah. Now let us consider an example which is closer to the actual private equity, where you have $10 million of equity, $90 million of bank loan, and the interest rate is 10%. Now, I would recommend paying a bit more of attention at this point because this schedule can get a bit confusing otherwise. The free cash flow every year is 20 million. The interest expense is 9 in the first year. Why? Because that's just 10% multiplied by 90. That gives us this 9. So the remaining free cash flow to equity, or after debt, after interest expense, is 11. This is a cash sweep scenario, so no dividends, because cash sweep. So we are not going to pay any dividends to our shareholders, so no dividends. So once again, now we have 11 for the cash sweep. The book value of debt is 90. So now we pay this 90 down by 11 that we get from these free cash flows. And the remaining book value of debt is now 79. Okay. The book value of equity goes up from 10 to 21. Why is that the case? So the debt is very straightforward. You pay down the debt because it goes down from 90 minus 11 is equal to 79. But why does the equity go up?
I think the company is not paying any dividends, so the dividends or the excess cash flow, which is not paid for interest, is added to the equity in the end.
Yeah, and Felipe?
So if you're paying debt, the enterprise value is only 100. So if you're paying debt, you have more equity left. So that's why is 11 increase on equity, because you pay 11 on debt.
That's exactly right. So because we are not paying any dividend, whatever cash sweep is left is going down to paying down debt, and the enterprise value is always 100. So in that case, what is happening is that because this is 100, think about what equity is. Equity is the residual claim to the company. So when the claim of debt goes down, the claim of equity goes up. The pie remains the same size, and as a result of that, the book value of equity goes up exactly by the amount that you're paying down debt. Let's follow through this for one more period. Now you have got book value of debt of 79, book value of equity, which is 100 minus 79, that is 21. Free cash flow remains the same. The interest expense now is 8. Why 8? Because 79, that's the remaining book value of debt, multiplied by 10% is equal to 7.9 or roughly 8. The free cash flow to equity is 12. So it's slightly higher than what it was before because the interest expense has gone down. This is now once again still 12. You pay this to 79 down by 12, which gives you 67. And then you end up with the book value of equity, which is still the residual claim, 100. You repeat this for each and every period, and eventually you end up with very low book value of debt, high book value of equity. If you're paying attention over here, let's change the colors. The interest expense is going down. On the other hand, whatever you're paying, because this is a cash sweep, on principal is going up. Secondly, the book value of debt keeps on going down, but the book value of equity keeps on going up. This is just the final sale value, so that's something predetermined. Okay? And that is exactly what we see in these charts. The payment on principal keeps on going up, whereas the payment on interest keeps on going down. Similarly, the payment on the debt component of debt or book value of debt keeps on going down, whereas the book value of equity keeps on going up. The other thing to keep in mind over here is that if you do the internal rate of return calculation here, is you end up with 41, which is a higher internal rate of return just by taking on more leverage. So you take more leverage and then you end up with a higher internal rate of return than what you'd had without leverage. So just with leverage or with these greater, modically annular violations, you end up with a greater internal rate of return in this LBO example. All right, so how about this? Let's take around 15-20 minute break. So it's 9:26. Let's come back at around 9:45 or 9:50, and then we can continue. Let's keep 9:40.
Sorry, can I ask a question before you go? It's just regarding the assignment. Maybe this is my group's confusion, I don't know, but on question 5, that relates to the sources of value, so synergy and control, you suggest to use both quantitative and qualitative approaches. And I was wondering, because the only way I remember you teaching us the value through quantitative, it's knowing about the value of the acquirer also, which we don't know. At least I don't think we do. So is there any other way to use quantitative approaches to know the sources of value?
The other quantitative approach is simply to look at the target on its own and just to look at the net present value of synergy. So there were two main ways that we looked at synergies. The first way was to just look at the synergies of the combined firm, the synergies without the combined firm without synergies, and subtract to get the synergies. The second way is if we exactly know the precise value of each and every line of synergies. So remember we had this spreadsheet as an example where we had just the present value of synergies, the offer price, but nothing about the acquirer. That would be the other way that you can look at the acquirer value.
Yeah, but do we have that
Sorry,
information?
No,
Because
sorry, go on.
your example on the Excel, I know what you're talking about. It's really specific. We have a lot of information on the actual synergies provided, but do we have that information on the case study, or are we supposed to assume it, like give numbers to it?
So in this case, if you do not find any value of synergy, that's perfectly fine. Just very clearly state that you don't find any value of synergy and then potentially mention which alternative value you are basically, the acquirer is basically planning to derive from this specific acquisition. So it could very well be that they are undervalued. It could be something like what we covered right now, that is Modigliani Miller, or it could just be like the Heinz case study where it was just really a strategic buy without any specific motivation given.
Okay, thank you.
And for the because this question came up as a general question, a general answer, I would also say that it says if necessary use quantitative and qualitative. It doesn't necessarily mean that if you don't use one of these two methods that you're going to get penalized necessarily for it. It just is how well you argue for that final question. Yes, Jose?
It's about today's class. It's a few slides back. It's when you mentioned so you first introduced the Modigliani Miller, but about the undervalued assets. It was in that slide. It says yes. That's so. When we are mentioning buying undervalued assets as a source of value, like do we say it's similar to control and synergy, or do we insert the undervalued assets into either control or synergy?
Well, if you cannot identify any source of control, or if you cannot identify any source of synergy, then you obviously can just say that it's buying undervalued asset, because buying undervalued asset is a motivation on its own. In this case, why I mentioned is because just to clarify that these things are not exactly mutually exclusive from the value of control, especially because efficiency gains can be derived just by buying undervalued assets.
It's because I was thinking that it's like in this case of the leverage buyout, like it's if we buy an undervalued assets, and then let's say by control we know that the optimal management will make the value of this company increase, let's say in the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years, and then we resell it, like that's the motivation is buying an undervalued asset, but we can say that we did it because of control, because we think that in that amount of time we can increase the value of the firm. So would that be like possible?
Yeah, that would absolutely be possible. So buying an undervalued asset could mean in two ways, right? One of them could just be that if it's going to remain public, then you might just expect that the market itself might realize that the value of the firm is going to go up. On the other hand, if it's just going to remain private, then in that case, the only way you can derive the value is through a value of control. So if you have like a really well-run firm, but that is undervalued by the markets, then in that case, you really are kind of, just buying it so that till the market realizes its real value. In this specific case, because the market is not involved, you kind of gain the efficiency operating gains, and then you sell it back to someone else in the market.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Yeah. I'll just be back in a little bit, and then I will answer any other questions. Yeah.
she is installed, looking very nice indeed. I did have to change out these cables because I was using the white cables before, but I think they must have been damaged from being twisted for a long time because they weren't going in the PCI slot. So, and it's going to be replacing the 5600X. And there we go, she is installed, looking very nice indeed. I did have to change out these cables because I was using the white cables before, but I think they must have been damaged from being twisted for nice and secure. This is an ultra-wide, it's 34-inch, it runs a resolution of 3440 by 1440p. If you want to know how many pixels that is, it's around 5 million pixels. If you want to compare that to other monitors, a 1440p monitor runs around 3.5 million, a 4K monitor runs around 8 million, and this thing kind of sits in between those at around 5 million. And this is an ultra-wide, it's 34-inch, it runs compare that to other 5 million. So it's pretty difficult to run, and it's also 120 hertz. So even the 3090 isn't going to be able to crush like 120 hertz ultra settings at this resolution on every single game, because it's just not going to happen at this current point in time. Some games are very difficult to run. Having said that, the 30 on how accurate, I think it's very impressive card. I'm excited to show you guys the benchmarks. In terms of how I've benchmarked them for the first 7 games, I've used the in-game benchmark tool.
Yeah, I think someone had a question before I left, so I think Francisco had a question.
FPS at ultra settings. However, in my experience playing, the majority of the time it was actually more in the mid to high 80s range. Very impressive. GTA 5, despite being a game from 2013, still looks great today, and the best part is this card absolutely crushes it. At ultra settings at 3440 by 1440p, it averaged around 137 FPS. Another gorgeous looking game, Horizon Zero Dawn. The 3080 here managed an average of 83 FPS on the ultra preset. If you're willing to dial the settings down a bit to high, you can easily maintain 90 FPS. Up next we have Far Cry 5. Now the benchmark on this one I feel was very fair, with an average of 105 FPS. It goes up and down a bit depending on what's going on in the environment. That being said, it never dipped below 100. Shadow of the Tomb Raider is yet another amazing looking game, and it's well optimized too. On the ultra preset I was able to get an average of 118 FPS on the benchmark, which is kind of crazy. Super smooth, super crispy. The 3080 crushes it. This one is an interesting one, Watch Dogs Legion. If any of you have played it, you'll know how horribly optimized this game is in its current state. The benchmark spits out 70 FPS as the average, but honestly, I barely maintain 60 FPS driving around the city. It's kind of ridiculous. Even at 1080p, it's just constant lag and stuttering. Very disappointing, and that's not even with ray tracing on. Classic this resolution, that is some impressive frames. Need for FPS. Again, dependent on the map, it can go up and down a little bit, but at ultra settings. And next up, Hitman 2. There's quite a lot of this resolution. To be honest, you'll usually get around 80 FPS. Sometimes it'll drop to 70.
Professor?
Yeah.
I think there might be a problem with the poll on Moodle for the office hour, because you only want the poll for us to say when we would like the office hours, not as an allocation of slots, right?
No, it's just the top 2 most chosen ones. Yeah.
Because for me, Moodle says I cannot vote anymore because all the sessions are full, so I can't give my vote anymore. Maybe you can have a look at it.
Yeah, I think I know what has happened. I think I misunderstood what had. Okay.
Yeah, Professor, I also can answer the poll.
Okay. So I have removed all the limits. And can you check now whether you can answer the poll?
Yes, it's working. Thank you.
Perfect. Yeah, I think the issue was that I thought the limit was basically limiting how many times you could answer, but it turns out it was limiting how many people could answer per option.
Professor,
Yeah.
I have a question regarding the group assignment. Like concerning the assumptions, how specific do you want us to be? Like, for example, when we project revenues, can we, like, for example, like take an average of the previous years and then like use it as our base for the next ones?
Yeah, that's perfectly fine. So if you can take the average as an example, you can also create like a sort of schedule where you are going to have basically like high growth, and then it's going to slowly end up going to a terminal value. So it's up to you how you can choose. But I wouldn't expect you to say project like market shares as an example.
Okay.
Professor, I have a question regarding the leverage buyout. Just to make clear, so you said the company has debt to acquire the target, and then uses future cash flows to pay off the debt. But I wasn't sure which company is acquire or the target.
So the way it works is that the acquirer basically uses the target company. Maybe I should write that down. Uses the target company's cash flow to pay down the debt. So it will basically it's using the target. It's kind of like a self-contained operation in the sense that you will use everything from the target.
Okay. So the acquirer basically uses the target for whatever purpose, and in the end, after a couple of years, it sells the company.
Exactly. So it is very, very similar to private equity, where you have something very similar structure. Just give me a second. I'm trying to bring the private equity things as well.
But doesn't it seem like a little bit similar to control? Because basically what the acquirer is doing is taking over control of the target.
Yes, so they are definitely getting value from control. Absolutely. That is definitely the case. But having said that, they're also getting a lot of value just because of the multiplier the tax shield. Because, see, if it was just control, then why would they need debt to begin with? They could very well just, do the entire transaction through equity. Suppose if they were liquid enough. In that case, what the debt does is that it provides them with this tax shield, which helps them generate value. So because of that, that also plays quite a... So the tax shield of debt, in addition to control, plays a role in determining the value of in creating value for the firm.
And is it possible in leverage buyouts to have any source of synergy, or is it a completely separate thing?
No, so in leverage buyouts, you cannot have synergies. So you typically have control in leverage buyouts. That's the idea, because also in leverage buyouts, you're not necessarily combining the firm. And in addition, synergies are... So when you're buying the firm and keeping them with you, then you kind of can get the synergies, because synergies are resulting from combination of the firms. In this case, you're kind of buying an entire firm just as an asset, and then you're selling them off.
Okay. Okay. Thank you, Professor.
Sorry, Professor. I have one question regarding the group assignment. That is, for the debt to equity ratio, should we use net debt or debt? And I'm asking you this because net debt is fairly different from debt because they have a lot of cash, and so the ratio is far smaller. So like if we are to consider the market value of equity, let's say, and the book value of debt as a fair approximation to the market value of debt, and do the net debt to equity ratio, it is a lot different from the debt to equity with book values.
Just give me a second. So let me think. From what I remember, it's net debt, but I will check that once again. And if someone knows, then correct me if I'm wrong. From what? Just give me a second. Wait, let me open up my own notes. Yeah, from what I know, it's net debt to equity.
Yes, and do you think we should use the market value of equity or the book value? Because it seems more reasonable to us to be using the market value of equity, but it's like one is 600,000, the other is 170,000, so it's just really different values.
So when you're using the book debt to book equity, then it should be both book for sure. But yeah, so it should be both book.
Okay, thank you.
But let me double check on that because I'm saying all this from the top of my memory, so I will double check and get back to you.
Yes, and also like for the valuation, can we do the valuation assuming that we are in the beginning of 2010, because that's the first year of our forecast, but in reality we are like in September or something, from what we understood from the case. But can we assume the valuation date to be the beginning of 2010?
So one approach that you can do is you can just extend the 9 months of 2010 to make it the 12 months of 2010. So that can form the first basis of your forecast. So then, wait, let me think. Yeah, so that can form the basis of your forecast that way. You can start by first having, so one approach is just to take the 9 months and make them the 12 months, if it's till September. So that is one way you can have the first year as the estimated, and then you can have projected from there on. Does that answer your question?
More or less, because we don't have the values on the income statement for 2010. Like the last year we have is 2009. So.
Okay. Yeah. So sorry, I don't remember the assignment off the top of my head because it's been a while since I looked at it. But yes, if you don't have the income statements for 2010, then you need to start from 2010, the projections. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And I also just have one more question, but that's regarding the mock exam questions. I remember that from the Heinz case, the long-term growth rate was like 1% or something, but it doesn't say anything on the mock exam question. So for like question 3, are we supposed to assume that the long-term rate is at 1%?
It doesn't say anything, so let me check. What was the acquisition premium? Was this reasonable? Yes, you're talking about the assignment questions, I presume, the Heinz assignment questions. But yeah,
the mock
typically in the exam.
Questions, yes.
Okay, so typically you will always be given the you should be given the growth rate. You don't have to, if nothing is given, then you can assume it, and then you will get the points because it's missing information in that case. But I didn't realize that it was missing in this case. But I will, let me open up that problem sets. Okay. I can't find it immediately, but yes, typically it should be given, and if it's not given, then you can make an assumption.
Okay, and also on that mock exam.
Right, it's not given.
But also on those questions, the change in net working capital. I mean, if we are, I think that maybe it's a mistake and it should be 0 because of the value of the free cash flow in the end. Because if we are to consider this change per year, the value would be like negative or something.
Yeah, and actually
Yes, it would be
the
negative.
values in the change in net working capital and free cash flows are the exact same. That is very odd because I actually took it directly from the Heinz spreadsheet. So let me have a look.
But so is it supposed to be 0 for the change in net working capital?
Yeah, in that case it should be 0 because otherwise it's an error. Projected free cash flows. Okay, I got that from my calculation. Just give me a second. Yeah, then it should be 0. But yeah, thank you for pointing out this error. I will rectify it.
Okay. Yes, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you as well. I did not know there was this mistake in the.
Tipo, eu sou mais professor. Estou a gozar, mas tipo, nós tivemos uma aula daquele gajo que agora não me lembro. Tivemos um Excel, não me estou a lembrar do nome da cadeira. Tipo, o gajo dava Corporate Finance antes. E ele disse que nunca se diz que a IRR é o que faz o NPV ser igual a 0. Porque isso não é o conceito. Tipo, ok, é verdade, mas não é o conceito. E o gajo acabou de dizer isso. Sim.
All right. So, okay, by the way, Francisca, you had asked the question, is it market or a book? It is market. You use market in case of public firms. So I checked, I think Celogere was a public firm, right? So you will use the market book to market debt to equity. Yeah.
Okay, so we like assume that the book value of debt is a fair approximation to the market value of debt because we don't have that information. So
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And is it fair to assume that the debt to equity that we have like currently in 2010 in I don't remember the month, but it doesn't tend to like remain like this forever. Does this make sense?
That is an assumption, so you can very well make that assumption. Does it make sense? Yeah, I mean, typically there are two ways that firms can manage their debt. First is just they can maintain a dollar value, the same dollar value. In other cases, they can do relevering, so they can constantly go maintain the debt to equity. So you can go with either assumptions or any other assumption that you feel is fair. This is just an assumption in that case, but typically a very common assumption is either standard like the same dollar amount or the same debt to equity.
Okay, thank you.
All right, so I've actually, Francisca pointed out an error in the mock exam questions in the free cash flows. I will check that and I will change the mock exam questions accordingly. So apologies for that. I did not realize because I had copied it from my Heinz the spreadsheet, but yeah, clearly that didn't go as well. So before we went off for the break, we were talking about the way leveraged buyouts are structured. I just wanted to give you a very quick snapshot of a PE fund, a structure of a PE fund. So the way a PE fund typically works is that you've got these general partners, and then you have got these limited partners. So limited partners are the investors, and general partners are the people who are the private equity firm who typically spend a lot of time and expertise. So when I talked about the, as an example, the, what's it called? The flight paper where, when the flights were jammed, at that point, general partners could not go to the firms. This was the link that I was talking about. Okay. Okay, so this was the link that I was talking about between the general partners and the portfolio companies. So limited partners typically provide the money. The general partners are more or less putting in the expertise and the effort. The effort dimension of general partners is non-trivial. So especially even in cases like leverage buyouts, these partners do put in a lot of effort in terms of monitoring as well as providing advice. So that is one thing. The second thing was, the timeline. So this is the PE fund timeline. It is very, very similar to the timeline of a leveraged buyout. So in this case, you have got an initial investment in capital, and then you have well, this is a bit more complicated and I will get into that, but then you eventually have the distribution. So that is very similar to the leveraged buyout in the sense that you have an initial investment, then you finally get the returns on those investments through your final cash flow. Okay, so where were we? Okay, sorry about that. Yeah, and we were here. Okay, so what we showed so far was how exactly the paying down in case of leveraged buyouts work, and how basically the structure of the interest as opposed to the principal works within leveraged buyouts. Now, there is an order of payment. So I think Alessandro had asked as to how, whether initially it's all just debt or whether it's equity. And at that point, I briefly answered that it's both. So essentially, that is exactly how it works. What this graph shows, or what this bar shows, yes, Alessandro.
Professor, I have a question regarding the slide that you showed us before, where there were the percentages of 99% and 1%. That's these percentages, basically the 1% that is invested by the general partner is just the money that they are putting in the investment, or is the management fee that the limited partner is going to pay to the general partner? Which one?
It is the money that they are. It is typically the money that is being put in, but the limited partners typically provide most of the funding. The general partners are mostly providing the effort, but the general partners still typically maintain a certain amount of equity in the whole structure. So it's not as though they don't invest anything.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. So in this case, the payment can occur, the financing occurs through a combination of equity, subordinated debt, equity and debt. And what you see over here is how the incidence of losses. So actually, let's just call this what it is. It's the incidence of losses. So what this means is that what we always know is that the losses are always borne by the equity holders because they have the residual claim. Then after they have borne all the losses, the second group is the subordinated debt holder. It is called subordinated debt because it's subordinate to the senior secured debt. And then you have the secured debt holders. So in case of bankruptcy, or as an example, in case of insolvency, it's the exact opposite way. The first payments will first go to senior secured, then it will go to subordinated debt, and then it will go to equity. That's exactly the way, even if it works outside of leveraged buyouts, it works in general like that, where the first payments will go to the senior debt holders, then the subordinated, and then the equity. And even within equity, it typically first goes to the private equity holders, the preferred stockholders, and then it will go to the common stock. So the subordinated debt typically consists of a high yield debt, which often pays a coupon. A coupon is kind of like it's a coupon is kind of like a regular payment which is made to debt holders. So bonds typically come with coupon. And then you have mezzanine debt. Mezzanine is, as you know, the word means, it's between the senior debt and the equity. So that's why it's called mezzanine debt. So the mezzanine debt often comes in the form of payment in kind, which means that when the debt, instead of paying in form of interest, it pays in form of additional bonds. And it often comes with equity kickers. So which means that instead of receiving sometimes the bond, you will just receive equity within the firm. So instead of having a higher claim on payment, you will then end up with more volatile payments, but you will still end up with, also the more of the share of the upside. So the subordinated debt consists mainly of debt, which is not the most secured debt from the perspective of the debt holders. So they don't have the immediate claim on the firm, which is why the incidence of losses first is on equity holder, then on subordinated debt. Then you have got these secured by senior debt, which is secured by the firm's assets. As I mentioned in the first slide, there is also the fact that they come with covenants. So what do covenants mean? There are positive covenants, which basically require firms to hit certain targets, as an example. There are also negative, positive, or affirmative covenants. And there are negative covenants, which often prevent firms from taking certain action. But this is how the order of payment occurs in the leveraged buyout. The incidence of losses goes from equity, preferred equity, subordinated debt, and then senior debt. So it goes in that particular order. And a leveraged buyout financing. So actually, let me get rid of this. Leveraged buyout financing occurs in the exact same way. You have got this purchase price. Let's say that it's being paid it is being financed using 25% equity, 75% debt in this specific case. Then you're getting some money from common equity, some other from preferred equity. So this is just standard equity issuance. Now, you have got revolving credit. What is revolving credit? Revolving credit, to reiterate what I said on the first slide, basically means that you get a loan, and when you pay down a portion of the loan, you get more loan for the amount that you have paid down. That revolving credit is often secured with assets. So it is revolving credit, that is what revolving loans are. And revolving loans can often be converted into term loans by paying certain fees. Now you have got the senior secured debt, which consists of term loans. Term loans come with covenants, as I mentioned a couple of times by this point. And then you have got these unsecured. So these two are more secured. This one is unsecured. So you have got the subordinated debt or junk bonds. And then you have got the mezzanine debt or second mortgage debt. So the mezzanine debt is the more important one over here, which basically is the debt. It's called mezzanine because it lies between equity and secured debt in terms of preference. And it often comes with payment in kind, which is that instead of being paid in terms of the bond, in terms of the interest, you get paid more so with additional bonds. You also have many times preferred equity in the form of payment in kind, where instead of being paid more dividends, you get paid in form of more equity. So that's how leveraged buyout financing works. Now let me provide you with a very precise example of this, because so far this is just all abstract graphs. We talked about Archer and Nabisco, and what was the last thing that we covered about them? Was it 109? Yes, so 109, which was 81 in cash, 10 in debentures, and 18 in preferred shares. Okay, so 109, which was 18 in preferred shares, 90 in cash, if I'm not wrong, and the rest in debentures, 11 in debentures. These were senior secured debentures, if I'm not wrong. Sorry, they were subordinate debentures, convertible subordinate debentures. Convertible debentures are those that form of debt which you can pay down, that you can convert into typically equity once it reaches a certain point. A big portion of that value comes from the fact that you can convert it into equity. So convertible subordinate debentures. So this was the payment format. This is how the payment was made to Archer Nabisco. Now, how does the financing occur? Now, this is a bit of a complicated chart, but I want you to bear with me as we go through it. So this is the consortium that KKR was leading and that eventually won the bidding war. What they did was they created this holding company, which was something called a Delaware Corporation. A Delaware Corporation is a corporation which is incorporated in Delaware. This was historically done because of certain benefits, certain more corporation-friendly laws which were existing in the state of Delaware. So as a result of that, there are many corporations which are incorporated within Delaware, but then they are operating throughout the United States. But it's a very American concept. So there was a Delaware corporation which was created, which was called Holdings. That Delaware corporation then held 100% of capital of this other Delaware corporation called Group, which in turn held another corporation called Capital, and then that held another corporation called Acquisition. So there were these 4 layers of corporations, which started off from this KKR, Kohlberg, Kravis, and Roberts, which eventually won the bidding war. Went down. It's like that story of turtles all the way down. But in this case, it's just corporations all the way down. And each of these corporations held within each other this control. And if you remember, in one of the previous lectures, I showed you an example of this, I forgot the name of it, it was in Italian, Telecom Italia, which had a very similar ownership structure. It was like the family owning one company, which then owned another company, then which owned another company, and finally that had ownership in Telecom Italia. So it's not directly often the ownership starts off from some point and ends at some point. It passes through many different entities. Passes through is a bad term to use here because passes through entity has a specific term, but you get the idea. Now, Archer Nabisco was taken over by KKR. So let's do that over here. KKR taking over Archer Nabisco. But then the takeover went through all of these groups. And what they did was that this acquisition company and Archer Nabisco would merge into a surviving company. So these two would merge with each other. And KKR, through all these holdings, Group Capital would then own this company. Now, the way it was raised, and I will have to erase some of the things because it's just overlapping. The way the equity was raised was that 1,400 came from KKR, remaining 51 came from Drexel, and another 25 came from another company called M&A Co. So together, these are forming like a consortium who are going to invest in this Archer Nabisco. Then you have got these senior converting debentures, which were then used to finance the transaction. So remember, we had in this case senior secured debt, equity, so equity, senior secured debt. So here as well, you have got these convertible debentures, and this was supposed to be cash. Sorry, I erased that as well. Yeah, so that is how the financing was raised. Then you also had bank debt. You had this PIK debt, or the payment in kind debt, and partnership debt. Together, that made up this much amount. Now, this much amount was then used to finance the equity. So the way it works is that you had KKR paying the equity. That went through ownership of each of these corporations. So each corporation owned each of the other corporation. Capital, which was the corporation which owned acquisition, was raising this debt. And then eventually acquisition and Arja Nabisco merged with each other. So if that was not clear, what is really happening in this case is, sorry, ignore the background noises. What is really happening in this case is that Arja Nabisco and acquisition were merging with each other, and KKR, through these layers, was really having an ownership in acquisition, the final company which was merged. And Capital was one of the main firms which really raised financing, and the financing was then put through into equity or debt. So I realize this might be confusing, and I have drawn far too many arrows. So yes, Alessandro, what I will do is I will draw nicer arrows so that it becomes clearer. But yes, do go ahead, ask.
Okay, so my question is that basically all these corporations and all these layers were just created to keep some kind of structural subordination, right? So just to divide, because I mean, I read that if you have the structural subordination, you don't need the contractual subordination to divide, for example, the senior debt, and after the junior debt, and after equity. So given this structure and these holding companies, you are creating they were creating some kind of structure in order to not have after a contract to manage this division, right?
Exactly. And also in many cases, but not in this specific case, you also have tax benefits. But in this case, because they were all incorporated in the same way, you don't necessarily have that. But you're exactly right.
Okay.
Yeah? Melissa.
I'm sorry, I don't understand yet the point of this structure. So first question, this structure of holding, owns group, owns capital, owns acquisition, owns RJR Nabisco, that already existed before this buyout, this LBO happened? Or was this created for this LBO?
It was created for the sake of the LBO.
Okay.
And this is not particularly unique.
Point of it yet, I'm sorry. Like, why would you want to do this complicated structure and not just buy RGR and Nabisco, except for some sort of tax reason that I understand?
So one of the things what Alessandro just right now said, which is the structural subordination. So you create this sort of structure within debt. And that's one of the reasons why you would create this structure. Another way is that it creates a nice legal format in which way you can merge a firm. So as an example, I think in the Heinz case study, there was this reverse triangular merger where you created a new holding company and then you merged it back into the merged Heinz back into that holding company. So it's often just legally convenient to engage in this sort of a merger.
Okay. Okay. I'll just take it. Thank you.
So I realized that this is, yes, Alessandro.
So is it also for security reasons, right? So it's just the structure is just created to separate exactly the owners of debts, of senior debt, and after junior, and after, so it's mainly security and also taxes purposes at the end. In this case, no, but in general, it can be, right?
Yes, it can be. Yeah, very much so. You're right.
Okay, thanks.
So, just to create a bit, yes, Tillman.
Yeah, just one quick question. Through this structure, does it also reflect that when the debt is paid off, that the equity share of the KKR, in this case, for example, who are holding interest or shares of the holdings company, increases over time?
You're talking about the, wait, let me see. You're talking about the flow from here to here, right? So
Yes.
KKR, whether they hold their ownership of the holdings company increases over time.
Yes, it's kind of a follow-up question to Alessandro's question or to what he said, because in the end I see that the holdings company is holding 9% of the acquisition or of the surviving corporation, and does this share of holdings in the surviving company, does this increase over time when the debt is served?
Yes, so the ownership of the ownership of holdings first of all, ownership of the capital goes on increasing because capital itself has a lot of debt is coming in through that, and then as the capital ownership in the surviving company increases, each of the upper layer, their ownership goes on increasing. So this graph that we saw earlier kind of repeats at each layer. And finally through KKR on to holdings. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, but let me just get rid of all the arrows. So to give you an idea, this is how this Archer Nabisco LBO structure was structured. The Archer Nabisco LBO was structured in the sense that you had this nested companies, which were owning shares in each other, and then finally holding the acquisition company, which together got merged into each other to form this surviving corporation. But that is one example of how this financing structure works. Now, let us get to exactly where the value in LBOs come from. The value in LBO, that is the main general pillars of value creation in our view so far, have been synergies, then control, then violations, and undervaluation. All right. Now, typically in LBOs, there are no synergies. One more reason for this is because of the fact that these LBO firms are not directly taken into, and not directly integrated, as we see over here, into the main firm. So it's not like what happens with proper mergers or mergers, in the standard format where these companies often are fully integrated or at least partially integrated into the main firm so as to realize synergies. So that's one reason. Another reason is because the LBO, the acquirers are often looking for firms which basically have control issues, so for which efficiency gains can be created to a very large extent. And in that sense, the main sources of value creation within an LBO typically occurs from the Modigliani-Miller violations, which is the tax shield, as well as the valuation simply through things like market timing. What does this precisely mean? So I believe previously someone had also asked with respect to, my apologies, I don't remember whom, but someone had also asked whether, this valuation is always just control. In this case, it can also be just market timing in the sense that you buy at the right time. So for instance, firms might be undervalued at specific times in the market, or it might very well just be that, So firms might be undervalued at specific times within the market, and as a result of that, you simply buy these firms at the right time when they are undervalued by the rest of the investors, and you sell them such that you basically are able to buy low and sell high. And that is one more way that valuation or undervaluation itself can create value. And then there's obviously the most standard way, which is just control, which we have already covered several times. But the new formats, especially the formats that the new form of value that we have not covered so far,
Então,
are
a
mainly
gente tem,
the
meu pai, não teve reação nenhuma.
Modigliani-Miller violations and undervaluation
Ninguém
within
é
the
que teve
market.
reação. Estou a ter aula.
All right. So this is a very simple flow chart over here, which just talks about different sources of value creation. So buyouts can occur both of public firm as well as private firms. Case of private firm, a major factor is providing access to capital. In case of public firms, it's often just alleviating agency problems. So as we discussed, general partners often put in a lot of effort into these firms. Similarly, in case of LBOs, they put in effort and they are monitoring these firms much more carefully than, say, retail investors might be able to monitor these firms. So thereby there's a lot of value creation by taking a public firm private. And in addition, in case of buyouts of private firms, it's simply you can create value by providing access. Now, these other dimensions are things that we have already talked about. This is just undervaluation by timing. This is deferring the payment of taxes, debt reduction, and operating margin improvement, which typically occurs to control. But more or less, this is just a flowchart, which pretty much encapsulates once again what we see over here. Okay. So here I'm just going to give you the valuation, the final results of this valuation done by Ruback in 1989, right when this entire Arja and Nabisco case occurred. The LBO was executed. According to Ruback, around $1.8 billion of value was created from tax shields. That is 20%. The remaining 80% came from operating or efficiency improvement. So this was mainly control. So as you see, a non-trivial portion is just coming from MM violations. And then you also have a considerable amount which is just coming from control. So in this case, the estimated value creation at the beginning was from these two main sources. What is obviously missing over here? Synergies, because synergies require often firms to be integrated. And in this case, there is no integration to begin with. This is just delving a bit deeper into different sources of value creation. Now, first one is obviously leverage and tax shield. What is that? Modigliani-Miller violations. You have got purchase, divestitures, exit. Divestitures are selling off existing all or few assets, and then exit. This is mainly coming from undervaluation. Credit, availability, and terms. Both of these are also what is this? Credit. So amongst the sources of value, what would credit fit into? Based on these two sub-bullet points. Yeah, Konstantin?
Yeah, maybe also value of control, so suboptimal debt.
How would this be value of control? I'm just digging a bit deeper. I'm not saying what you're saying is wrong.
Yeah, like providing the optimal capital structure.
Okay.
Maybe they have like loans with like high interest rates, and now the market conditions are better, so we can do like a refinancing.
So yeah, I mean, value of control does play a big role in credit. You're right, but in this specific instance, the answer I was going for was a bit more on. So what you said was right. Is that it's also value of control. I wrote down something completely different. Value of control. But here, credit, that is availability and terms, specifically refer to, once again, Modigliani-Miller violations in the form of missing slides, in the form of transaction cost. When we often talk about the assumptions surrounding Modigliani-Miller, transaction costs also include those costs which are like frictions in raising capital. So as an example, if I know you and therefore I'm willing to give you better deals or better terms, those are forms of transaction costs because I am hinging the actual debt on something which is, say, something like reputational capital. So that can also be transactional cost. So in this case, credit is also a form of Modigliani-Miller violation, which occurs through transaction cost. Now, on the operation sides of things, you have got the same things: additional investment, growth opportunities, control, selling things, underperforming assets or divisions, focus-related divestitures, once again, control, and cost cutting. This is also just control. So everything on this slide is just all about control. Here we had Modigliani-Miller violations, and once again, what we also see is that the financial side is much more affected by these MM violations, which is obvious because the MM violations do originate mainly from that side of the business. All right, so let me provide you with a few examples over here. So sources of values, exactly you know how this would work. So margins and exit multiples. What are exit multiples? When you sell, often you look at the sale prices or the potential sale prices in the form of exit multiples. Here it's EV to EBITDA multiple or enterprise value to EBITDA multiples. Now, in the first case, you just have debt reduction, very specific, very simple case. In the second case, the additional improvement is from margin improvement as well, which basically refers to this improvement in EBITDA and improvement in cumulative cash available for debt repayment. Here. What we see is that something that we would expect, which is that when EBITDA increases, the overall enterprise value increases, and the internal rate of return also increases. So you effectively end up with a higher enterprise value when operating margins improve. Now, case 3 is a bit more unique. This relates to valuation. So what we spoke about earlier was timing. You purchase when the timing, the sale of the firm is very important. So when the exit multiples are higher, I'm not sure why that became a brighter red, but when the exit multiples are higher, then in that case, that is when this is happening over here, then in that case, holding all these other things, improvements constant, our internal rate of return still increases and equity value increases. Now, this is not something fundamentally groundbreaking in the sense that, you tweak around one multiple, then automatically you see that these equity value increase. That is something expected. But having said that, what is unique, what is special in this case is that higher exit multiples or exit multiples are typically these EV to EBITDA multiples as an example, which tell us the prices that we are likely to receive in our final sale price. So when the sale price goes up, in other words, our EBITDA, our EV goes up, or enterprise value goes up, equity value goes up, and internal rate of return goes up. In other words, timing the final sale is very important. All right. The other source of value that we talked about was disciplining mechanism. Now, if you remember in the first class, and if you have heard that book, Barbarians at the Gate, which I would recommend just because it's a fantastic book about, how these things work, more so the human side of these things as opposed to more the theoretical side of things as to exactly how interactions between people drive these LBOs and mergers. Effectively, one thing, if you remember, was that there was something called the Taj Mahal of corporate hangars. I'm not able to write on this, but yeah, Taj Mahal of corporate hangars. So RJR Nabisco had this fleet of 36 jets, and this was built during Johnson's free spending reign at RJR. Now, this company was historically known for being a very stingy company, where one example that they give was that you had to return the pencil nibs to get new pencils, as an example, but then they changed the entire culture. In the first lecture, we looked at this from the perspective of say, entrenchment or management using the resources incorrectly. In this case, we are looking at the solution to that management misbehavior, which is in the form of disciplining mechanism. So this Arsia Nabisco's Air Force was sold by the owner, by the KKR, to Bell South. And there's actually a very nice research paper on this, which the source is kind of just out of the slide. Or it is just out of the slide. That's a shame. Well, but there's a very nice paper on it. I think it's by Edgett in 2013. What this paper really shows is that the ratio of corporate jet seats which are actually used to the sales basically declines after LBOs. So when is the seats to sale ratio high? When there is greater, managerial spending. But when LBOs do occur, there's this disciplining mechanism where this ratio sort of goes down. And that is a very nice way of visualizing this disciplining factor, where the managers of the firm get disciplined by these new owners who are carefully monitoring them. So this is the paper. The source is just outside the slide, I presume. Now, the disciplining mechanism consists of carrots and sticks in this case. So the management is typically given some form of an equity stake. So in that sense, the managers and the owners' incentives are aligned. But at the same time, the stick side of things is that because this PE fund and management own 100% of equity, they are very closely monitoring, and thereby they can guard against these private benefits. So they can prevent against this managerial free spending, the entrenchment, or as an example, empire building. So all in all, this source of value talks about disciplining of the managers of the firm when they undergo an LBO. The previous source that we talked about was much more so about the Modigliani-Miller violations and value of control. Once again, what you see here is there's no synergies which are being realized. So this is just an overall chart, which I don't expect you to remember. I just want to illustrate. So in case of this publicly owned model as opposed to private equity model, what you see, and this is what I was talking about effort, is that you have, say, 20 hours per month equating to 0.1 FTE, and you have got 0.4 partner FTEs. And then the ownership of the firm, as an example, sorry, not ownership, the change in CEO senior management occurs in 69% of deals, whereas over here, actually, I'm surprised that they haven't put it in the, so it's within 100 days in 39% of deals, but typically it is higher. I'm just a bit surprised that this was not also expressed in the form of changes, percentage changes. And here what we see is in line with the first class, which was that only 36% of boards actually see themselves as good at cost reductions. On the other hand, in the case of private equity model, you do see that the cost cutting does occur quite successfully. So, all right. The final portion of this slides, which is about exit. If I'm going too fast or anything like that, just unmute yourself or raise your hand so that I can go back to something. And as I mentioned right at the start as well and halfway through, this particular lecture is going to be only tested in the form of multiple choice questions because this is just 1 week before the exam. I don't expect you to, I realize you might have other courses as well, so which is why this is only going to be tested in multiple choices. Now,
excuse me. So the exam is multiple choice plus 1 valuation and 2 questions that we can choose from 4, right?
The exam will be 15 multiple choice plus 1 mandatory question, which is not going to be necessarily valuation. If anything, it's going to be simpler calculations, plus 2 out of 4. So in other words, if you're not comfortable with valuation, you can just, do the qualitative questions here and you can do the mandatory questions, the mandatory question and the 15 multiple choice.
There will not be a case study to, I don't know, 5-6 pages to read or more theoretical?
If you bear with me, what I will do is I will just finish this particular set of slides and then I will show you exactly the kind of case studies to be expected.
Sorry,
yeah?
Thank you.
Oh, no, it's perfectly fine. I just don't want to go between documents halfway. Yeah. So the exit, okay. We started off with this LBO. How did it start off? You have this takeover, very standard style, which is going to be financed in a very specific format. And it's going to be also supported by the assets of the target. Then you're going to use the cash flows of the target to pay down their debt. And once that occurs, once you have reached your goal debt to equity ratio, or once you have reached your goal in terms of the exit multiples that you want to have within the market, then you will exit. Exit means sale. So that is where these mergers kind of differ from LBOs in the sense that LBOs typically involve holding on to a company for a short period of time before selling it off. In case of mergers, you would basically hold on to the company and integrate the company. So very successful cases of mergers often just involve holding on to the company and then integrating it, and then basically the combined company enjoying a lot of synergies. In this case, what is happening is, by contrast, you sell off the company. And that is precisely why, even before they invest, LBOs tend to think about potential exit strategies. And much like private equity, where private equity investment during recessions tends to give out better returns, timing is everything in LBOs as well. So the typical exits that occur in LBOs take 3 forms. The first one is trade sale, which is where you sell the entire company or sell the target to a company which is aiming for a strategic buy. What this means is that you sell the company to an acquirer which wants to integrate this company and potentially derive synergies from it. So in this case, you completely get out of the entire LBO. In the second case, you have got something called a secondary buyout. A secondary buyout essentially implies that the sponsors, the main sponsors, sell and other investors remain. So in this case, for instance, KKR would sell in case of Argia Nabisco, and other investors would remain. This is very similar to the trade sales, but typically it is known empirically to generate fewer returns as compared to trade sales. And finally, I've got IPOs, which means you just take the company public, and whatever proceeds you get, then you're getting those proceeds in return for all the effort that you're put into that LP over time. So typically exits take these formats. In case of Argia Nabisco, this is a very infamous example. What the company did was very standard. What KKR did was that they first reduced the leverage and then they took the company public. So this is very standard. This not so much. They took the company public in 1991. They acquired the company in 1989. So as a result of that, basically, they took the company public very quickly. What KKR did was it progressively sold off its investment, and then it finally sold off everything in 1995 at original price. Original price. As an acquirer, that is the last thing you want to happen, because you want to generate a substantial return on your investments. And while this by itself may not be super indicative as to how much returns they gained, as I showed you in the first class, what happened with Argia Nabisco was that despite all this gigantic LBO, the fund booked loss on RGR case, to the extent that Kohlberg Kravis, never agreed to never put in such a large investment into any particular fund. And if, as an example, they had not invested in this Argia Nabisco and this one more case, if they had not invested in these two particular funds, then they would actually have ended up turning out profits. So in their case, the KKR's case, this LBO turned out to be a very terrible transaction, despite the fact that they initially estimated that they were going to end up with this value creation in form of tax shield and operating improvements. Essentially what happened was that they overpaid for the company and then they were not able to realize the value. Not a very unique scenario, but something that we see quite often. And this is not entirely because companies are being dishonest. In many cases, it's just because of the fact that companies, it's estimating the exact value is not very straightforward. So a bit of empirical evidence on the types. The most common is the strategic buyer, which is the trade sale. The second most common is the secondary buyout, which is the buyout firm. And then you have other forms of exits, which firms engage in. When do they tend to typically sell? Most of the sales occur around between 5 to 8 years, whether in the form of secondary buyout, trade sales, or IPO. And remember, one fact that I introduced a bit earlier was that around 5 to 7 years is the exact timeline in which the LBOs don't pay any taxes because of the debt that they have incurred or because of also the restructuring. So in that sense, these Modigliani-Miller violations often play a big role on in terms of timing the sale. They may not directly be, estimating it in that way, but nonetheless, because they play a role into a calculation, still the exit plays. The empirical evidence shows that around the same time when the tax benefits run out, That's around the same time when most of these exits occur. All right, so what the questions that we started with were is why do firms decide to merge? That is something that we covered in the first chapter. Do mergers really create value? Also first chapter. And why do some mergers succeed and others fail? Also first chapter. How to value a company, which was actually a bit misspoken, but still we covered that in chapters 3, partly in 2 and 4, and also in 5 with control and synergies. And in this chapter, we talked a bit more about what drives the financing choices of firms. And especially, we talked a bit more about one specific financing choice of a firm, which is LBO. So overall, we started with these questions, and to a certain extent, we have answered most of them. So that concludes all the lecture slides. So if you have any questions on this, please do ask. Otherwise, I think Lorenzo had asked me about the exam, so I can go to that. Yes, Melissa.
Could you go a couple slides back? There was one about the disciplining mechanism.
This one?
No, again. Yeah, this one. So at the top it says you give management an equity stake, but at the bottom it says that the PE fund and management typically own 100% of the equity. So in this case, you mean that the management of the company together with the PE fund, they hold 100% of equity? Because in the beginning I was confused because I thought it was contradicting. But maybe I just
misunderstood. So together they kind of hold the 100% of the equity, and because they hold 100% of the equity together, they are guarding against these private benefits, because especially the PE fund is going to very closely monitor the management.
Could you still argue that the problem might not be fixed completely because the managers owns a relatively small proportion of the equity?
Yes, but then there is obviously the equity, which is just the carrot side. But then you also have the stick side, which comes more so from the PE funds who monitor. So it's just the monitoring. So on one hand, you have got the reward, which just comes from the equity stake. So whatever you're going to, put in effort, you're going to reap the rewards. On the other hand, you also have the monitoring. So I think this was a bit poorly worded in that sense, bullet point, but it should be more so that the PE funds monitor these managements very carefully. And that is more so the effort that is put in, which is kind of over here. So actually I didn't explain, but the FTE refers to the full-time equivalent or the amount of man hours spent by these partners. So if you see here, it's almost 4 times the amount of effort.
Okay, I see. Thank you.
So any more questions on the slides, or shall I move to the problem set? Okay, I will take that as a no. So let us first find the problem set.
This is tough. Good job. Still does the job. Let's power this bitch. It even says CPU, so I can't mess up.
Alright, so to answer your question, Lorenzo, let me actually move this. Yeah. So to answer your question, Lorenzo, the case study in the exam will not be 4 or 5 pages. It, in this case, starts around here and ends here. So it's exactly 1 page, but there's a lot of fluff in there. So that's a bit deliberate in this case. I deliberately put a bit of fluff because I want you to be able to figure out what is relevant and what is not. Now, this looks like a lot of questions, but to give you an idea, you will have, say, 1 mandatory question and then any 2 out of the remaining 4. And I will also potentially put a line limit. So you will have to answer the questions within a certain number of lines. Otherwise, there might be some of you just might feel pressure to write a lot, which should not be the case. So it is these 4 as an example, and you will have to solve any 2 out of these 4. And the first one will be mandatory as an example. This is, I mean, these are all mainly qualitative, but you get the idea. And with the view to the multiple choice questions, the level of calculations that you will have in the multiple choice question would be something like just calculating the earn out, which is just a 2-line calculation as an example. You just have to first calculate the excess of the projected over the excess of the realized over the projected. And then the second one, if you are asked for it, is the excess of the realized over the projected multiplied by the multiple, divided by the number of years, multiplied by the multiple on an annual basis, minus the payment which is made, which gives you the shareholders value. So that would be just a 2-line calculation which you would have to do. So that would be the level of calculations required for a multiple choice question.
Okay, thank you. And we'll upload the solutions this weekend, right? For the problem sets.
I will upload the solutions latest on Monday. The reason why I'm not promising this weekend is also because the exam comes a bit in the way. So I want to get that first out to the faculty affairs. Otherwise, we are going to have a lot of technical difficulties on 20th. But yes, I will upload them as soon as possible.
The exam will be on computer, or we will write and then send photos, or we will write on the computer or per hand, for example.
So the exam will be on the computer, from what I understand. And yes, so the photo dimension, I think the way Moodle functions is that you will do your calculation on some scrap paper, and then you can take a photograph of that and then post it online. If that is not permissible, then I will eliminate the need for putting up calculations. At most, you might have to just type in some formula or something. Yes, Constantine.
Something about clicking on this link to report me. And in my head, I was like, surely not, they're not that arse. But then,
this was a mistake.
Okay. So are there any more questions? Otherwise, I will see you at the office hours, which I will announce somewhere. Oh yes, Melissa and...
I have another question about the buying an undervalued company. So would it also be possible that the acquirer just buys a company because they see it's undervalued and they are very confident that this will change in, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 years, but then they don't do anything to it. So they just buy it, let it do its thing, and they are so confident that this will increase in value so that they can just sell it later on. Can that happen?
That is perfectly possible, but that's a very risky strategy. I mean, in general, just buying an asset because you believe it is undervalued might itself be a very risky strategy. But it's a bit like, there's this whole literature about how private equity funds typically just, which are started during recessions, are often outperforming those which are during booms. So just timing without doing much more can often yield a lot of results. So it's similar to that in this case as well.
Okay, but then the preferred option would be you might buy it because it's undervalued, but then you still put in some extra effort to make some changes to increase the value or to increase the probability of an increase in value.
That is the more typical option. So typically these funds do put in a lot of effort into disciplining as well as trying to extract the value from control. So in that sense, yes, that is very much an option, but it is much more so common that they will try to extract the value of control from these firms.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, Konstantin, do you have a question?
Is there any equipment needed? Like, do we have to download like the Moodle app on our mobile phone in order to upload it, or?
That is an excellent question. I will check that. Let me write that down somewhere. Actually, I will just.
Okay, and then the exam, you will upload a PDF, we will download it, and then we will answer the questions rapidly on a Word document or.
To my understanding, the way it works is that you do everything within Moodle. That's at least the tutorials that I have seen, but I will check that once again and put up an announcement on that factor. But let me write that down, otherwise I'm going to forget.
Yeah, so then please keep in mind that maybe it's like very difficult like to switch from answering to the text, so we need additional time for that.
Okay, yeah, of course, sure. So definitely
everything's like more complicated. You can't highlight anything, and make stuff a bit more complicated.
Mm-hmm. Okay, point well taken. Yeah. Yes, Francisco.
Yes, Professor. I was just wondering regarding the solutions. I was just wondering if when we got the solutions on Monday, as you said, the answers that you are going to provide is just simple answers. I'm just wondering because when you have questions with calculations, it's just the final number, or you have the rationale behind it. Just for us to understand.
For the so it really for as an example, the more qualitative questions I'll just provide like a suggested answer and few bullet points. I'm not going to write down the whole answer, but for the calculations, if you would prefer, then I can put the entire calculation. But that's a matter of preference. So
yeah. It would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, if you could do it.
Okay, sure. So let me also make note of that. Yeah, Lena, you had a question.
Yeah, that refers to the Heinz case. I think we had one problem set initially, and then you uploaded another one with questions. So is the first one not relevant anymore, or will you still upload answers for that?
I can upload the answers for that, but the reason why that confusion happened was primarily because of the fact that previously we were going to have something like an Excel spreadsheet exam. Then halfway through, I was told that basically the Excel spreadsheet may not be the feasible option, so we switched to the calculator. So that's why this confusion has occurred. So the Heinz mock exam questions are the ones which will be the closest to what actual exam will look like. So I will mainly post the answers to that one. But for the first ones, I can definitely post the answers if you prefer.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, I mean, it would be helpful anyways, so thank you.
Let me also add that then. Yes, any more questions or?
Yeah, and it would be also nice if you could clarify, because like we received the email with the 2 cameras on, and how we should like handle this in the exam.
To my understanding, that was only for ViceFlow, right? It's not. I can clarify that, but to my understanding, that was not for Moodle.
Okay. No, nice.
I will check that. I cannot guarantee. Yeah.
Okay, but in this case, we need only one camera on the normal camera on of our computer, and our phone can be off.
I do not know. I can check that and let you know. But my understanding was that ViceFlow was the only one which required, which is precisely why I didn't want that, because if you're going to look at your calculator, then they're going to consider you cheating, which makes no sense.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. João?
I don't know if it's already in Moodle, but just a suggestion. Maybe it would be good to have like a doubts forum so that everyone can make doubts, and then everyone can see other people's questions, and yeah.
Sure. So you want me to create like a discussion, something, or? Okay, sure.
Yeah, it's more like it's better than the emails, even probably for you, because probably you receive a lot of emails.
No, that's perfectly good. I will check how to do that and put that up. Unfortunately, I'm not super familiar with any of these platforms that they make us use here, but I'll check how to do that. Yeah.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm. All right, so
Professor, sorry, I have another question. Just to clarify, when are the dates of the office hours?
That really depends on what the final answers are. At this point, I don't see everyone having responded.
Okay,
I
so
only think 14 people have responded.
oh, so you're gonna announce later when
Yeah, I think I'll give time till like maybe end of weekend, like end of
Okay,
Sunday,
okay.
and
Okay.
then everyone who has not responded, I mean, it's yeah.
Okay, thank you.
All right, so thank you very much for attending this course. I will see you at the office hours if there are no questions right now. Otherwise, I'm more than happy to stay on the call. If you have emailed me, I will get back to you over the weekend or latest by Monday. I'm just first finishing up other things, the exam and the problem set solutions primarily, and then I will get to you on Monday. Yeah?
Professor, just last quick question. The exams are corrected by an external grader, or you are the grader? How is it working in those terms?
Sorry, I missed what your question was. Sorry.
So the correction of the exams is done by you or by other graders? I don't know, some TAs or.
So it will be done by the teaching assistant, Ricardo, and one more teaching assistant. I'll have to check, but I won't be grading the exams for sure. But I will be telling them, giving them instructions on this.
Okay, thank you.
All right, so then I will see you at the office hours. Thank you very much for attending this course, and good luck for the exam if I do not see you at the office hours.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you. Bye.
Ooh.